I bet you Krista has learned more about county government than she ever wished to know.
I know a lot. You.
So we're still waiting for a quorum. We've got 2 judges, Andrea, district attorney, and Sheriff Bigg still outstanding.
I think the sheriff is out of town, so I don't know if he'll attend.
Okay.
Maybe he's back. I don't know.
Well, I hope they join us. We've got big plans for them.
I know.
All right, we got Andrea on. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we do have 4 out of 7. So I guess we have a quorum, but we are missing both judges and the sheriff.
Well, Dave, I'm glad we're getting a new roof because they're leaking again in my office.
You are.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it wasn't even that part of a rain. So
No. How soon is the roof coming? Have you heard anything? I haven't.
yeah, I think they're going to have some people do bids later this week or next week.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad we made that decision to do the whole roof.
Andrea, most of us just have to imagine what the weather is like. You actually get to experience it.
All right. Well, I think we can get started. Hopefully the judges will be on their lunch shortly and be able to join us. And it sounds like the sheriff might be away. So we'll call the meeting to order. I think the roll is obvious. And then, so we need an approval of the minutes from the February 24th meeting. Oh, there's Kevin right there.
There it is. I'll make that motion. Prove as printed.
David, second by you, Paul?
Yep.
All right.
I would
Any
just like to
discussion?
note there is one name listed twice, so we'll omit that oversight there. I think,
Maybe they
Chris,
were
you were
twice as
listed twice.
attentive.
Okay, so any discussion? Otherwise, all those in favor of approving those minutes from February 24th signify by saying aye.
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 All right, motion carries. Staff report, Sarah.
Okay, a couple of different things. So we did have the Cjcc County Board report on March 17th. It was a fairly comprehensive report, as you all had courtesy copies. It was about 43 pages once it was said and done. We did have some good feedback as far as just the comprehensiveness of the report, but really no questions for me at the county board meeting. So seemed to be well received and understandable to the county board. Next point, I'd like to update the group on the county board directional plan. So we've been working with the Judiciary and Law Committee Chair Jim Tripp to devise a criminal justice policy for the updated directional policy or directional plan for the county. So that was approved. The policy and the implementation steps were approved by Judiciary and Law earlier this week. So that'll be going to the executive as part of their, the county board executive rather, as part of their exercise in really looking at the directional plan and updating it as far as what's relevant and what to move forward. So that's part of the process, was just to go through Judiciary and Law and develop that a draft policy, so that is in motion. And I'm sure we will learn more about that, in time once it gets reviewed by executive to see if we kind of remain as part of that directional plan, or if one of our initiative as developing the criminal justice policy is dropped from the directional plan. But it seems like there's support with the judiciary and law to really continue what we've been doing as far as really the Cjcc working together to really bring efficient, effective criminal justice policy in the spirit of all of our different discretion and roles that we have, that we're really just working together overall. So nothing controversial there. And it again is in the just in the next stage for the county board. Want to give update that the governor did expand the vaccine eligibility for corrections and public safety. Now it covers court personnel, so that's excellent. So some folks have had opportunities to get vaccinated as being part of other eligibility classes, but now it really does expand that to courts and personnel. So that's good news for a lot of us that are doing different programs, court-related programs. Let's see, governor's budget, that is, as you guys know, is kind of in the works. There's a lot of things related to criminal justice in the budget, but really until it gets through the legislative process, it's really unclear what will fly and what will not fly. There is an increased dollar amount for TAD funding, so that's what we use to fund our treatment opportunity program. So that could be positive. And then there's a lot of other budgetary issues, really looking at increasing public defender pay, increasing DA pay across the board. There's a lot of different things. I think it's too early to really see, what's gonna get through the legislative process. But WCA is keeping good tabs on that. So, and several of us are connected with WCA and plan to just continue to watch that as we move ahead. Regarding WCA, there was a justice and public safety meeting last week or the week before. Supervisor Tripp joined me as my guest, and so did Chris Corpola. The topic was youth justice, so it was an important topic. But they also highlighted a concern with DOC not paying for state inmates that are housed in our local jails. So we were able to kind of relay that topic over to Sheriff, and he was already on top of it and well aware of some of those issues that were going on. So again, I think it just illustrates how WCA, just having those connections can help us all stay informed and really working together towards those common goals that counties have. Let's see, Naco legislative conference is going on. So part of the Justice and Public Safety Committee of Naco meets during the legislative conference. So that was on Monday with some meetings. They really looking at proposed policies for Naco coming up from the counties. There's a lot of discussion on alternatives to incarceration for that crisis population. So that's one of our priority issues as well here. And then there was quite a bit of kind of discussion and lively discussion about gun violence and just the just more communities out there really identifying gun violence as a public health threat and wanting Naco to take more specific action, not just against violence, but gun violence. And then there is a Naco technical assistance opportunity that I ran by Director Corpola and Clerk of Court Shalley. Katie runs our data work group, and this is an opportunity to sit through 4 different sessions throughout the course of the year and help us kind of ready, set, and measure related to mental health incarceration. So that's a part of we're part of the Stepping Up initiative, and this would be a free opportunity to learn more about how we can really use our data, use our information to to measure the folks that are coming in and out of jail. Some of our previous measures that are and ongoing measures, we definitely see that mental health is one of those issues that a lot of folks have in the jail, and then substance abuse, as we know, looking at our data. So that's my staff report, unless there's questions on anything I covered or didn't cover. All right, back to Chris.
All right. Agenda item number 5. So Sarah and I, in preparation for this agenda, well, actually prior to preparation of this agenda, I'd sent Sarah an email so that we would remember. But I don't believe that this group or the Cjcc as a larger group have ever had a more in-depth discussion about racial justice and social justice in our community and in our system. And it feels, given all of the attention that's that is getting nationwide, maybe even worldwide, but certainly nationwide, it felt like it was a good time to be able to say, is there something that we as the leadership within our county in the area of criminal justice should be doing to take a look at issues? And as I said to Sarah, I don't even have to start with the premise of whether there are issues, because we know that there are issues nationwide. So I don't know why Dunn County would be and when I say issues, I just know that there's controversy and conflict and a lot of stuff moving around in those particular areas. So I just opening it up to people's thoughts about whether it's something that the Cjcc should be tending to in a new or different way.
Do we have evidence? I see the sheriff is with us. Hey, Sheriff. Do we have evidence of arrests or citations that seem to overemphasize minority populations versus our actual demographic mix here in Dunn County?
If you truly want to study that, you have to look at who's committing crimes, not the population, and who's being arrested. So I will say that we're close to representation. If anything, Asians would be over represented based off their population, but I personally have an issue with the whole topic because law enforcement arrests people that commit crimes. We don't choose their race, and personally, this is I believe this is a political agenda that has been started nationwide, and you have to look at who's committing the crimes. Okay, are they being overrepresented in our prisons, or being charged unlawfully, or unrepresented or overrepresented by our courts or by a DA's office, by law enforcement? I think we have to look at who's committing the crimes before we can truly get an evaluation of whether there's injustice.
Yeah, just if I may, Chris, and sure, big thanks for your comments there. But I think the fact that when you talk about racial or social justice, I think we'd have to say we've been, I use the term sometimes, but we've been misinformed, or we've been hiding under rocks if we don't know that that exists. I get what you're saying, Kevin. I hear you. But the fact is, whether there's implicit bias in what we do, I would be very surprised if there wasn't. And, you know, this is something that this has been going on for hundreds of years, and we've never gotten beyond it. And it's just part of our fabric. And to ignore it and saying it doesn't exist, that would be very narrow-minded on our part. So back to the question is, what should we be doing? And I think it's part of one of those things which we've done often with our CJCC or whatever. Do we have somebody, we've done it at judicial conferences, for example, is to come in and understand what that bias looks like and, you know, what divisions we have. Once we know we've got it and we can define it, then you can react. How do we take that into consideration in carrying out our responsibilities? And so, Chris, back to what I'm saying is you probably need to do some looking into, do we have a method to have we've had presentations before that would be very helpful. It'd be something for the CJCC Council as a whole. I think that could be available to, or should we develop something that would help us work our way through this? But I certainly think in these days and times it's out there, and maybe we're lucky in Dunn County that it sometimes doesn't, rear its ugly head, but it's certainly out there. And I think we all have a responsibility to recognize it as we move forward. And so, Chris, that's a challenge for us. You as the chair and Sarah, it might be something that we need to look at and say, okay, how do we take that first step to just demonstrate that Dunn County's working on it? Those are just some thoughts.
And I, if I may, Judge, I agree with you. I guess what I'm suggesting is not that we have a racial profiling or skewed application of our laws based on race or anything like that. But I think it's worthwhile to demonstrate that we've looked into it, that we've scrubbed the numbers. What is the mix of races when it comes to the arrests or the citations that we're handing out? Sheriff, it's not, in my mind, an issue whether or not these people have committed a crime or guilty of an infraction. It's whether or not we've taken the time to demonstrate that we don't have a bias in applying those rules. Presumably, we're of course only citing or arresting people who actually have violated the law. That's probably not the point that those who advocate for racial justice are concerned about. What they're concerned about is there a disproportionate attention to people of color when it comes to applying those laws? And I'm not saying that there is here in Dunn County. I do not know. I think it would be worthwhile, however, to look at our records, if for no other reason to say, yes, we're aware of this issue, as the judge was saying, we're aware of this issue. We're actually paying attention to it. We're tracking it. And here's the results that we found. And whether or not those advise us or inform some change to policy, procedures, or approaches would be dependent upon what we find. But the exercise seems worthwhile to me.
I might be wrong, but I believe we have that data to show, our incarceration stuff, and it's been part of Sarah's reports over, the last few years. But by the way, I'm instructing down on the range, so if you hear gunfire, they're not shooting at me. So
You're not shooting at us, right?
Exactly.
Just to go off of Kevin's comments there, and I've heard similar things from Chief Atkinson, really, when we're comparing our arrest demographics or our jail population to just the general public, that I think it's a well acknowledged in law enforcement that that's not really a representative population comparison. So, that's what our dashboard kind of just uses as that census reference. We've got a new census coming up. So those are, once we get the data from that, we can update that. But it really, I think law enforcement really looks at the pool of people that are getting arrested. What percentage of those really are people of minority. So we do have some different lenses and different measurements that we're seeing. We do see more than what we would have in our general population, just representation. So the numbers are small, so month to month it can skew, but I don't think we've done that next step to really kind of to say that we have looked at this. We do care about this. We do want to be mindful of it. We don't know what to do about it. I mean, we've been tracking and measuring that, and really just kind of seeing who's coming through our doors. But I think there could be a next step as well, as far as us looking at our data, or even publishing some sort of report that kind of articulates some of what, you know, Kevin said, and what we're hearing from other law enforcement as a comparison group.
Let me suggest to you this, I guess, and then I'll shut up after this. Where I'm coming from would be, what I would see as the problem is if somebody was to say, based on the numbers that we already gather, hey, have you noticed that 60% or 70% of our arrests for cannabis are Black Americans? And here we are in a county that is 88% Caucasian. Now you could argue, well, those are also arrests being made along 94, you know, so it's not necessarily, you know, Dunn County residents, but that's the kind of thing that can make it seem, whether it's accurate or not, can make it seem that we are insensitive to the issue if we're unaware of those kinds of statistics, should they exist. And doing what you were just saying, Sarah, since we're already tracking it, just being overt about our effort to evaluate the numbers we have and assess them in terms of racial justice, equal treatment under the law, is probably an exercise that would be worthwhile and to acknowledge overtly.
Well, and my guess is we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Somebody has looked at this data before us, maybe not in Dunn County, but somewhere.
Yeah, I don't think
And
it's a
at
complicated
least,
thing.
yeah, just at least can sort of ferret out what some of the indicators, whatever the conclusion is about what they mean. The data are the facts, and the interpretation is what we apply then to those facts to figure out what it means for our county. But
Yeah, the racial justice and disparities is really a hot topic across the spectrum. So I know the state is working on measures as well, just really trying to prioritize that with the different funding and program standards that they have. So I think there's a lot out there that we can glean. And I know Chief Atkinson was also able to dig a little bit deeper in this new RMS system to identify some trends as well that he thought could be used by the jail to run additional data. So I think definitely we could take a look at what's out there as far as how to dig into this, and then we can do that ourselves to look at, you know, the data, the facts piece. But then I think that interpretation piece is important as well. And we've had to do that with other kind of data measures that we have to really help put it in perspective.
well,
So I
and
guess-
I don't. Oh, go ahead, Andrea. Go ahead.
I guess my question would be, what sort of data are we collecting? Are we collecting, you know, arrests, traffic stops, convictions, and then just knowing, as Paul Miller said, we do get a lot of crimes off of 94, you know, people who are not local Dunn County residents, and how does that affect our numbers? So I just want to make sure if we are gathering this data, we're digging deeper to determine, are they a Dunn County resident if we're comparing it to Dunn County statistics, because we do have a large amount that aren't local here.
Which is part of what we did with the OWI data. You know, figured out that what was it? A huge percentage of people were not Dunn County residents.
Yeah, and we're going to have demographics on some, but not every point, you know, across the spectrum. So, you know, maybe at the point of arrest, but not necessarily the point of conviction, unless we have track that information back previously. But it could be pretty tricky, and it could be pretty in depth. So I think it's something that, you know, we're talking about two different things here, I guess, of the conversation. One is an education piece, and then one is digging into our data and seeing what that actually means to us locally. So those could be fairly in-depth projects as well, and ongoing projects, you know, that
I'm
were
just suggesting we use the data to inform any next steps, which run the gamut from the null alternative, we don't need to do anything, to, yeah, we need to make some changes in our approaches, or education opportunities, or public awareness, or whatever else.
And just, and Mr. Miller, just to take a little bit of a different perspective on it, when you said look at the data first, I think part of it is to be educated and be informed of what that bias is, so we know that we're looking at the correct type of data, you know, because our perceptions are going to skew what data we're looking at, how we analyze it. And if we're not informed of our biases, we may be looking at that data incorrectly. That's all I'm saying, is I think it would be helpful to, shall I say, be informed of what bias looks like, and have we thought about that? I'll give you an example. It's pretty simple. Been on the bench a long time, and I can be doing jail appearances, and I'm setting bond, and we're setting bond one after another. Just all of a sudden somebody comes up, and guess what? I look out at the table and somebody doesn't look like me, and I got to set the bond. Now, everything can be very similar, but there's one thing different. That person doesn't look like me. And how do I handle that? And so that's kind of what we're, you know, you're really dealing with here. And do we like to think that we're all, if I asked any of us, are we biased? And we'd probably say, no, we're not biased. But it's kind of more complex than that. And I think we got to understand that first. And that's my only point. I won't say anything further because I'll be riding my Harley Davidson when you guys are talking about it.
So one of the things that I heard, two things that come to mind that I heard recently so things like this prompt my thinking when I think about these things. I don't know how to interpret this. This was the data. So your chances are 8 times greater to be convicted for the same offense if you are a white person who committed a crime against black person who commits a crime against a white person versus a white person who commits a crime against a black person. There could be 3,000 reasons why that's the case, but so those are the data points that kind of make me go, I wonder what that looks like in our community. Like what does that mean? And then the other thing is that I also heard a great speaker who spoke to implicit bias. And I love this line, and I've repeated it multiple times. Implicit bias is not an indication of how you act. It's an indication of how you've been influenced. So you can have biases. We all have biases all over the place, and you can still act in an unbiased fashion. But it's the recognition, I think this is what you've been saying, Judge Smeltzer, it's the recognition that you've been influenced by a multitude of things.
And you have to take that into consideration and properly react to it.
So I'm taking away from this conversation 2 points. One would be to identify and do a little bit deeper dive into some of the data, and then use that to sort of decide what the next steps might be. Consensus?
Is there any action needed on that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we can do that on just the recommendation of this group. Does anybody think that shouldn't be what happens?
I'm just amazed at Judge Peterson's ability to hold one expression without changing it for so long.
Krista too. She's good at that. Every meeting she looks the
I was
same.
going to respond for him saying he was.
All right. It's items 6. Consideration of work group reports and recommendations. I would assume, as usual, those have been provided. I'm sorry, I didn't look at them. Provided in a written format. Any questions or comments about those? Because they lead kind of directly into our next, and I want to leave us time to talk through number 7. So if you'll recall at our last meeting, we talked about whether or not we should, like, taking a look at the work groups that are a part of the CJCC, and do they stay, do they go, is it time again, maybe on somewhat of a 5-year annual or 5-year basis, to look at whether there's some restructuring, or we should be doing business, continue to do business the same way, or change it. And so, so Sarah and I met a couple of times to kind of talk this through. And Sarah, do you want to take the lead in that conversation?
You bet. And I'm going to share my screen in a minute here. But right, we talked about really kind of restructuring to be more nimble, more responsive to ongoing and current needs. We have a bylaws for our council that really have us use work groups to focus on different tasks, and those are created and then completed, really task focused. A lot of the work that the work groups have done have really become processes and protocols that we follow. I think data is a good example, where every month we're reviewing the data. It's almost like clockwork, as far as us, we have those relationships built. We're able to look at the data, we're able to validate the data, and then, put it out there. We get feedback on specific projects and things that are ongoing. But when we're talking about the perpetuation of the work groups, we have only closed one out in our history. The rest we keep adding on. And this conversation was really sparked by our treatment court advisory and family treatment court advisory, and really looked at the utility of those groups, the purpose of those groups. And I think this really is an opportunity to kind of align a lot of our activities. We've got a lot of groups, a lot of meetings, and sometimes at the meetings, we don't have the key people at the meetings to make decisions or take things back to their agencies. We're pretty diffused in our topics. Some of as we're kind of updating our goals and objectives for this year and have new leadership of the chairs, sometimes we start to go in different directions. So as a kind of proposal for us moving forward, Chris and I took a look at perhaps creating a new committee, an operations committee, that would really have all of the different work group activities would really kind of fall under this operations group. I'm going to share my screen and kind of show you what we're talking about. So 2 different things when we're talking about the work groups and ending those. So we've got different work groups. Some are making progress. Some are really just focused on ongoing things. But a lot of them have kind of started slowing down or meeting less frequently. So there's other groups working on different projects. So the idea is really of an operations committee to kind of funnel all those activities. We would have our primary criminal justice and behavioral health or human service director part of the operations committee. And we are looking at the monthly data. We are, reaching out to our communications when we need to get that group together. We have Katie still kind of the chief of the data. So she's able to pull that group together to look at specific data projects, perhaps like the one we were just talking about. So I'm going to share my screen so I'm not just randomly talking here. And Chris, I don't think I just put this together. So this isn't something that you've had the benefit to look at. But really, if we created a new operations committee, we do have a decision whether that's a special committee, which we can just create under our current bylaws, or if we want to create a standing committee. Currently, we only have one standing committee, and that's our executive committee, this group. If it's a standing committee, we do have to have permanent members identified and responsibilities as well, where that would require a bylaw change. And I do have some draft language if we decide to go that route that we can kind of look over quickly. But the idea of the proposed operations committee is really, we've got that core group of criminal justice stakeholders. They're aware of what everybody's doing. They're coming together. They're really kind of making more of a cohesive leadership group. There's a lot of brain trust, so to speak, with our past chairs. So speaking of Judge Peterson, Chief Atkinson, we've had a history of once somebody kind of takes a leadership position, then they kind of, give opportunities for others to step up, and then they kind of step back. But there's so much knowledge that we really want to keep that part of our decision-making and how we're making informed decisions. The oversight of CJCC programs. So this is where we talked about the family treatment court oversight, treatment court oversight. Then we have some grants that require oversight groups. So right now this executive provides some of that oversight, but I think the operationals group could really attend to those programs more. We would have the key players at that table too, if we're looking at making adjustments or changes to those programs, which could be helpful. For example, just increasing referrals into those programs is a goal that was identified by the data work group. The operations work group would report to the executive. So the executive would really retain their membership, their responsibilities as far as focus on budget, agenda planning, just moving ahead with the council. But it would afford for less executive meetings. So we would meet prior to a CJCC. And then we propose that this new operations committee really meets monthly, but then we wouldn't have those ongoing work group meetings that so many of the familiar faces on this team really are in all those groups. I'm thinking of Chris and Andrea and Kevin. You guys are in so many of the different work groups that if we can really consolidate those into one, that we're all really getting the information at the same time, and we're able to, if we got tasks, we can activate the different teams. If it's communications, we've already got those relationships built and ability to put things together quickly. We've got our data team that's led by Katie and ready to go. But then there's also other, priorities or areas of emphasis that have come up, and there's other groups working on these things. So it's like, how can we collaborate more with them? Housing is one. It's been identified in our groups that housing is important. We have public health working on housing. We've got just a lot of different groups working on housing. Youth justice, enhancing crisis options are some of those other areas that really are priority areas that we can kind of fold into some of this, because as we're taking on more and more, we have less focus on the priorities, because our depth becomes thinner as we're spread out doing more. So this operations committee can help really funnel all the different ideas and start to prioritize where we spend our energy and our focus. We want to continue to further the initiatives. So, and these are, Chris and I described them as kind of lenses that we look at different topics and areas. We're looking at through that data-driven justice. We're looking at through evidence-based decision-making. We're looking at through that Stepping Up initiative to reduce incarcerations. And then we've got our local initiative as far as the alcohol initiative to really educate and inform. And then, as I mentioned before, there's just other groups out there. We talked about Project Hope. There's some, duplication of efforts with some of the other groups. So really just trying to connect some of those activities of the other groups to what we're doing and vice versa. So in a nutshell, I can see the purpose of the group would be to consider and recommend actions and policy to the executive committee. And then that would go on to the full council, provide oversight, monitoring the ongoing operations, programs, our collaborative programs and our grants, identify areas, for review and digging in a little bit deeper. identifying those priority areas for us to focus on, continuing the data gathering and evaluation, and then making recommendations of courses of action, ideally through consensus when we can reach that. There's a lot of benefits, as I mentioned, just kind of consolidating our meeting times, making sure that we've got the right players at the table, helping us focus energies and being able to be nimble and relevant to the membership and opportunities that come our way. So if we, like I said, there's a couple different routes we can do. I do propose membership. And again, feel free to chime in here. I'm kind of going through it fast, but I want to make sure there's enough time to discuss. Key members would be courts, law enforcement, human service, prosecution, and then defense. It's been challenging getting any consistent defense representation or kind of engagement, but I think that's an important piece. So it could be, you know, Chris, Kevin. I think it's important to get chief involved because if we're making, you know, decisions, you know, I think that's important. Judges, plural, and that number might change. Right now in the executive, we just have the presiding judge is the member. But I think all judges would be relevant to the decisions and part of the conversations that we're having. Certainly the district attorney's office, the clerk of court's office, and then an idea to really connect closer to the board could be the judiciary and law chair or a delegate that individual identified. Leadership could be co-chaired. So rather than have a new chair every time, it would be really whoever's chairing the CJCC and the vice chair, but that shared responsibility as far as kind of vision and leadership. Proposed to meet monthly, and then again, they would report to the executive and the CJCC. As I mentioned, executive would meet less, really just looking at meetings prior to CJCC or when there's action items for the executive, but not to have meetings if there aren't meetings. In the past, we've really wanted more executive meeting because this group is so critical and we want folks to be part of the decision-making. But sometimes what we're talking about, we don't have all the players to really understand the ramifications. So it's really creating another committee to kind of vet and make recommendations prior to getting to the executive level. And then, as I mentioned, the executive would retain all of their responsibilities. So it's not any changes there. It's just really creating another group with more responsibilities and collapsing some of the work groups and really having more of those task teams really start up and feed into the operations as needed. So that is kind of my thoughts about how to proceed. So I think I did include our bylaws in the packet for reference. So if we go with the standing committee where we clearly identify to make it a permanent fixture in our council, we would need to identify the membership, the responsibilities. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again with a different share. So if we create a special committee, we don't have any bylaw changes to make. We just create it. We recommend, this committee can recommend it to the council and the council can approve and we can get that up and running. If we want to make it a standing committee, a permanent committee focused on moving forward, then we would need bylaw changes. So this would essentially add a second committee. So a paragraph 2. And then I highlighted, you know, some of the verbiage that I had on the document there. And then really just renumbering 3 and 4 for work groups and special committees. So I think there's you know, plenty to discuss here. I'm going to pause and let Chris kind of navigate the discussion at this time.
So I think Sarah did a great job of summarizing what our thinking was as we talked this through. I think for me, it comes out of probably three things. One, recognizing that I'm at an awful lot of meetings with the same people. And as Sarah mentioned, sometimes without the right people at the table, but can't ask them to be in another meeting. Secondly, it comes out of our having the right people or having people together on a regular basis has allowed us to have a finger on a pulse of things that are up and coming that we can move quickly on, and sharing that knowledge base is and kind of trend base is helpful. I think could be helpful to us. And third, recognizing that the CJCC in its current structure, given the size of the county that we are, has reached its capacity. We don't have a lot of capacity to add more meetings and more work groups and more projects. If we're going to do that, we have to do that more purposefully and also with the plan in place for how those initiatives will fit or be worked through, whatever fit within the structure and or how they'll operate once we move forward. So I'll just use as an example, even though it's, you know, it's, I mean, we out of not necessarily the direct, but out of the relationships, Sarah, Eric, and I, you know, did the CDBG grant. And thankfully that's going to be relatively straightforward in terms of administering it. But if it were anything more than that, we need to be thinking about how that's going to be, you know, managed and sustained more collectively as a group. So that's just one example. But anyway, so those are my thoughts. Paul?
So two things. Tell me again, how many of the committees that we have had are we mothballing?
Almost all.
Okay,
Almost all, I would say. Andrea's group, the DEC work group, has a number of identified specific goals. And I guess I'd like to hear from District Attorney Nodoff about if she'd like to retain that as a work group or not. Because I think that one is probably the one that is probably the most active at this point.
okay, so before I yield the floor though, so that's good. I'm in favor of fewer committees, one committee doing more of the stuff. So that seems to be a good idea. Observation number two, I don't see why we wouldn't start this as a special committee. Let it run, see how effective it is. And if in fact it proves effective for doing what we wanted to do, we can at any time amend the bylaws and create it as a permanent standing committee. So those are my thoughts.
Judge Smeltzer.
Yeah, Mr. Miller and I are having a debate today, so I'm going to suggest something else in response to him. And this was in anticipation of what Ms. Benedict was going to say today relating to this operational standing committee or special committee you talk about. One of the simplest things, and you talked about being nimble, I would look at our bylaws and change B under section C, 1B, and it says propose to the council the formation of work groups and special committees for the executive committee. And I would change that to authorize the formation of work groups and special committees. And then under 2 work groups, the council, you still could retain to the council as a whole. They could recommend, but in 2, and the council may recommend to the executive committee special committees. But by doing that, you leave open the opportunity for council at large to be able to initiate some action. But then also under the executive committee, you could do exactly what you want to attempt to do here is establish a special options committee. And then you do away with the rest of them and it's a done deal. But it gives you the flexibility to do it either way. Just a suggestion.
So in direct answer, in direct answer to Paul's question, we would advocate for concluding or completing, but probably concluding as the actual work groups of communication, because I think the thinking being that there would be someone on the operations committee that would have sort of primary responsibility for having a finger on the pulse of that need. So if we had a communication need, there's an identified person that sort of we can tap into for that. But so communications, because they're running pretty just routinely. Data is running pretty routinely. The outstanding question, and we'll circle back to Andrea in a bit, about the deck work group. Evidence-based decision making and stepping up, we see as more like their initiatives, and they needed some structure to get them off of the ground, but now they are that lens that we look through to say, is the programming that we're taking on evidence-based? Is it reducing our mental health incarceration? We're kind of, it's more of a lens we look through than necessarily something that continues to need a work group. And then the family treatment court and the treatment court oversight or advisory could easily be functions that could be folded into the operations group. So outside of DEC, which can continue to exist as a work group until it completes its sort of whatever activities, I think the rest of them would potentially be concluded. Andrea?
So I'm completely fine with folding the DEC work group into the other operations group. I think the main issue was getting the key players at the table working together, and we've done that, and we've had meetings outside of the DEC work group where we are accomplishing things. I think there will be a continued need for that, just to ensure, given the turnover between social workers and law enforcement, but I don't think we need a specific DEC work group. We can continue to achieve our goals, and I think we'll get those done within the next year.
David, you had comments?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Paul as far as going with a special group to start with instead of changing the bylaws. And that way you can kind of figure out who should be at the table before you change the bylaws and decide exactly who you want to be there. Unless I missed something when I saw the names or the groups that Sarah had for her suggestion at the table, it's pretty much the executive committee, except probably Paul and myself, replacing with Jim Tripp. I would suggest you just go with the executive committee at this point and add other people. If it's a special group, you can add people as you think you need, and the other people, if they feel they're not doing anything, they're going to drop out. That would be my suggestion.
So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying, Dave. You're saying instead of creating a special committee, just expand the executive committee.
No, not necessarily. I think it should be a special committee by changing the name. I'm just saying that unless I missed it, that the names that, or the positions that Sarah had on there was everybody on the executive committee except the two of us, and she was adding judicial and law chair, Supervisor Tripp. So I would have the special committee. That way you can add people to it. But I'm just saying, start out with the people that are on the executive and add to that list and give it a while and see how it goes. And then you can tailor it if you want to change the bylaws in a year or whatever, but then you'll have a better idea who should be at that table.
And honestly, this is a little bit, I'll identify my own secret newly developed agenda. But I could see easily how after we gave this a try and did some tweaking and refining, essentially the operations committee would become the CJCC. That you eliminate, because one of the struggles that I have wrestled with for a long time with those CJCC meetings is that they're largely report out. And there are a whole bunch of people who are already involved in all of those pieces along the way. I mean, there's a few odds and ends that that's not true for, but I think we could tweak that and refine that. We could actually make the CJCC a working entity and eliminate those quarterly meetings in the sense of them just being report out meetings. But that's a little ways down the road.
Yeah, I
where we
think
test-
that remains to be
test drive
seen.
this. Yeah.
But that's why the idea of a special committee is, I think, appealing, where we can really create it, give it a test run, and really see how it's functioning, and how that could impact other groups that we have. I think part of the challenge with the CJCC is it's too large as a group to really have the dynamics to be to the level of conversation that we need. So that's why we've had a lot of smaller groups, and looking forward to just the resumption of in-person meetings at some point, because I think it's been even more challenging with the dialogue of give and take and conversation on Zoom a lot of times.
Are you-
So
For this one, looking for a motion again, Chris?
yep, so this is, the first would be then, the first action item then is a motion to conclude. These would be recommendations that we would take to the full CJCC in April, to conclude the CJCC work groups and advisory groups.
So moved.
Have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion about that? All right, all those in favor of concluding the work of those work groups signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? All right, that part would be taken care of. So then the second part would be to looking for a recommendation again to create an operations committee. And it sounds like there's some consensus around that being under 2.7B2 a special committee. So I think let's create it. We can accomplish those two and then let's come back and talk about, or do we want to just go with all in one big old fell swoop?
I think you're gonna have a motion that says, a motion to create a special committee, the operations committee, consisting of the membership as outlined in Sarah's report, with the addition of the county manager and county board chair.
And can I just say one other
Actually-
thing as Erin's sitting here? Do we want probation? No? Yeah? No?
I don't think we need to identify the membership if it's going to be a special committee. Because that we were just, as to
Oh.
Dave's point earlier, we want to be able to pull in people as needed. But I think we do need that core commitment from this group that they're willing to commit, and then we can pull in those others as like Chief Atkinson, for example.
That's exactly what I meant. Thank you.
All right. So Paul made a motion. Did you have a second to that?
Well, actually, based on what was just said, the actual motion would be a motion to create as a special committee, the operations committee. Period.
Consisting of the executive and other members.
Yeah. So somebody should make that motion, and if nobody else.
I'll make that motion.
Okay.
All right. Can I have a second to that?
Go for it, Katie. Make your second. Do it.
I'm not a member of this committee. I don't think I can actually make a motion.
I saw Andrea reaching for her mouse though. She can.
Yeah,
do
I'll
it.
second it.
All right. Any discussion about that? All right, all those in favor of creating this new operations committee signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I,
All right. And then, so we would not have to do 7C in terms of amending the bylaws at this point in time. All right. CJCC meeting then, which this would become brought forward for approval, would be on April 8th. And our next meeting would then be May 26th. Any other business that needs to be conducted today?
I guess
Thank
I
you.
just want to mention that I agree that the CJCC regular meeting that we have has turned into just a report meeting, and usually we do some business, but it's seldom. So I agree with you that, you know, maybe it is time to work towards a change.
And one of the things we're going to do a little bit different this year is we're going to take on just doing some informing, educating, some topical kinds of things where we probably will have some presenters and some information that just create a shared knowledge base across the CJCC of particular topics. We've done some of that in the past, but have a focus on that for this year.
That may be a good change. Thank you.
And Ms. Corporal, that just on that point, and one thing that's partly our own fault. Sometimes we're, it's up to us on how meetings take place, what gets presented, how they play out. And one thing you mentioned, when that council as a whole was a way to reach out and extend to a greater community than just us who are operational type people that have to carry out all this stuff. But it kept us in contact with folks like Stout and other people that we would bring in, and it gets a chance both to air what we're doing and give it a community hearing, but then also thing that you could dress up your meetings that you mentioned a little bit on is have planned topics of discussion with expectation of input, and sometimes you get input from others besides ourselves that could be helpful. And so that's why that larger council, at least its original intent, allowed us to reach a broader base than just us who have to carry out the responsibilities. And I think you just want to remember that when you go forward.
Absolutely. All right. Absent any other business to be conducted, we are adjourned.